There are many anime that entertain us. Some make us laugh, some make us cry, but there are very few stories that actually manage to do something far more dangerous. These stories ask us a simple yet terrifying question. What happens when humanity tries to play God? This is a question at the heart of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, a story about two brothers who try to resurrect their mother using alchemy, but end up paying a price that will change their lives forever. Because underneath the magic systems, the character arcs, and also the adventures, there lies a far more darker and scarier secret. Because Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is not just a fantasy story about alchemy, it is a story about war, fascism, religious persecution, and also the terrifying consequences of believing that having knowledge makes us divine. Today, I want to talk about how this anime remains one of the most profound pieces of storytelling ever created, and how its themes of alchemy, power, and spiritual truth actually mirror some of the darkest moments in human history. Hello, my gorgeous viewers and readers. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. I hope your weekend was filled with short runs around the park, comforting meals, and also stories that send you straight down into a rabbit hole about magic, religion, philosophy, and also esotericism. Yesterday, I posted a video on TikTok and Instagram where I casually mentioned that I read manga and watch anime. And many of you were shocked about this. And honestly, I was surprised that you guys did not notice, or that you guys did not know, because I thought it was very obvious that I am in fact a dweeb. I literally have a full shelf of manga that I have read, right? But many of you came onto my DMs or in my comments and asked me what was my favorite anime. And even though I've read and watched my fair share of anime and manga in any sort of category like shojo or shonen, my favorite anime, and the one that always comes into my mind, is Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood follows the story of two brothers, Alphonse and Edward Elric. They both grow up in the nation of Amestris, which is a very strong and militaristic nation that uses alchemy both as science but also as weaponry. Alchemy in this world operates under a set of rules or laws, but the most important one and the first rule is that there is equivalent exchange, meaning that in order to gain something, you have to give something of equivalent value. And that is the first rule, but the more the story progresses, the more you realize that this law and the rest of the laws are actually way more fragile than we think. Apart from rules and laws, there are also forbidden acts that no alchemist can ever do. And the first one on that list is human transmutation, meaning bringing someone back to life. But as children, both Alphonse and Edward decide to try to bring their dead mother back to life. They try to resurrect her, but obviously this has catastrophic consequences for them. Edward loses one arm and one leg, but unfortunately for Alphonse, he loses his whole entire body until Edward manages to find his soul and preserves it into an armor suit. Because as I told earlier in the video, the first rule of alchemy is equivalent exchange. So in order to get a human, you need to give a human back. The problem here is that this alchemy test or this experiment doesn't quite pan out because they have never given a soul, which is what makes humans human. So obviously this experiment fails, and not only fails, but also they find themselves completely changed forever. Riddled with guilt, Edward decides to become a state alchemist, which is basically a government scientist and soldier, in order to find the opportunity to get the Philosopher's Stone, which is a rumored magical artifact that allows you to bypass the laws of equivalent exchange. But as the brothers travel across country in order to find a way to restore their bodies, they uncover something far more disturbing, and it's that the government of Amestris has a really dark and terrifying secret. The Philosopher's Stone is not created by divine blessings or magic or any sort of rituals. It is created by sacrifice. And this sacrifice has been built through the nation's history. All the wars and all the conflicts that the nation has had with the neighboring countries have actually been carefully manipulated and selected by the government in order to find this sacrifice, in order to find the human death that they need. So throughout this story, we see how the Elric brothers actually find themselves with a very uncomfortable and terrifying truth. The government they served, the government they trusted, and the magic they firmly believed in has been built in mass death. Now, there are many things I loved about this anime. I could talk for hours about how much I love the art style, or how much I love the characters, or the characters' relationships, right? I could talk for hours about all the things I loved about this anime, but I want to focus my attention on the main themes of the story because I think that's where the juice is. I will talk about the three main topics that I personally saw reflected in the story, starting with the consequences of religion in war. One of the most disturbing and terrifying aspects of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is the way it depicts war, because the alchemists or the state alchemists are not only scholars or researchers, they are actually living weapons. Like literally the government deploys them into all these wars and conflicts with the neighboring countries in order to annihilate and assassinate entire nations and populations, right? This is why they are called the dogs of the military, because they are literally animals. They are there in order to do as much damage as possible. They are there to ruin entire nations. The clearest example of this horror is the Ishvalan Civil War, which is nothing but a genocide committed by the alchemists towards the Ishvalan people. Like this was 100% clear to me from the get-go, right? The official justification for this war or for this conflict was that the Ishvalan people were primitive, they were extremely religious, and they were a danger for the nation, right? So therefore, they had to be eliminated in order for them not to cause any sort of terror towards the Ameshrian people, right? But the way they are portrayed, so obviously I mentioned that they are portrayed as extremely religious and primitive, but also irrational and dangerous. That is nothing but propaganda. That is military propaganda, which is something that is very similar to many of the conflicts that are happening right now or that have happened in the last century. The most clear and modern example that I have of this is how Western populations actually use cultural and religious differences in the Middle East, for example, in order to justify intervention. Like, I cannot remember how many times I've heard Americans or the US government say that they are going to liberate these Middle Eastern countries, but in reality, what they are doing is committing genocide, right? You are not liberating individuals if what you're doing is killing them, right? Another example that I have is how fascist regimes in Europe actually used the cultural, ethnic, and religious differences in Jewish and Muslim populations in order to demonize them, right? Because if you create caricatures like these ones and you create a propaganda that makes people afraid of these populations, what you create is you don't create humans, you don't create individuals, what you create is demons that people are scared of. And this is exactly what happens in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, right? The Ishvalans were never the enemy. They were just convenient victims that the government of Amestris needed in order to find power. And this is exactly what all these Western nations are doing in the Middle East, or the fascist regimes were doing in Europe. They were creating convenient victims. Another fascinating topic of this series is how they introduce all the philosophical layers. Like, this is a perfect amalgamation of esotericism, mysticism, Kabbalah, Gnosticism, but also metaphysics. This is the perfect combination, right? And the best example that I can give you in this series is the homunculi, the seven sins, but more specifically, their endings. Like, all the deaths of the seven characters are actually so poetic. It's almost Dantescan, right? It just reminds me of the Divine Comedy, because each of the deaths are actually representing not only the sin, but also a way to get away from this sin, right? To heal before you disappear or before you get your eternal justice. So the best example that I have here, for example, is envy. So obviously, envy, we know that as a sin or as a character, they are extremely radical, irrational, but also they despise humanity, right? And everything humanity represents. So we are weak, we are fragile, we are always jealous, we are just scum, we are bugs. In the end, we see how envy, the character, actually is the one that experiences envy or jealousy. And the way to cope, or the only way to not feel envy, is through human connection, right? So how I view it in my head is that obviously everyone has been envious or jealous at some point in their lives, right? But this jealousy or this envy usually comes from insecurity, from deep within, right? So let's say, for example, with envy. So let's say I have a job as an architect and I get paid 50,000, for example, but then there is someone next to me, a coworker with the same experience, that also is an architect, but actually gets paid more. I feel envy, I feel jealousy, because I want that money, right? But what I'm jealous of is not the fact that this person gets more money than me, because at the end of the day, I can live with 50,000 pounds annually, right? What I feel is that I feel inferior. I feel envy because I don't have this human connection, right? I don't feel like I'm being treated equally. And that is the thing that makes people envious or jealous, right? And this is why I say, or the series says, that true human connection, like true human bonds and compassion, actually is the solution against envy. Another great example is the character Pride. So obviously we know that Pride is the one who controls everything, right? He has the Leo puppets. He is arrogant and he knows that he has control over everything. He can control and manipulate his way into everything, into getting what he wants. And the fact that he is turned into a helpless child is actually so poetic and is so Dantescan, right? Because children have always been considered as helpless, useless, and defenseless, right? He, as a child, has no control over anything, because children never have control, right? So the fact that Pride, the character who has always been in control, who has always been able to manipulate and get his way, actually turns into someone who will never ever have control. And this pattern of poetic justice only reinforces the main topic of the story, and is the fact that the homunculus are not perfect or divine beings. In fact, what they are is nothing but an exaggeration of human flaws, right? They are not perfect because they are human. And at the end of the day, these flaws are nothing but self-destructive. Now, hear me out on this, let me cook, but I think that one of the star themes of this series is the fact that both the alchemists and the homunculus are actually two sides of the same coin. One of the most brilliant aspects of this series is the fact that there is ambiguity towards power, right? At first glance, when we first start the story, we see how the alchemists are presented as the good guys, right? They are the heroes, and the homunculus are presented as the villains. But the more we go deeper into the story, the more we realize that this binary does not exist, right? We see how alchemists are actually sometimes villainous because they are pursuing their own selfish reasonings or their own selfish desires, right? So, for example, we have Roy Mustang, who actually eliminates and commits genocide towards the Ishvalan people during the Ishvalan civil war, for example, or how Sho Taka actually kills his own daughter in order to create the chimera so he can still be a state alchemist, right? But even, for example, when we look further and we look into the homunculi, we see how even though at first glance they are evil or they are presented as evil, they still do good deeds, right? So for example, we have Greed, who actually sacrificed himself in order for other people to survive. This is the best example of how, even though there are evil people or there are villains and heroes in this story, actually the line between good and evil is actually much blurred than we think. Because this blurred line between heroism and monstrosity actually only reinforce the main philosophical idea of the series, and is that power itself is neutral. What matters is the intention behind this power. Because, for example, alchemy can heal, but it also can destroy, right? Alchemy creates life, but also can annihilate it. So what matters here is not that power exists. What matters is why humanity wants to control this power. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this series is how all these topics combine with each other. So obviously we have talked about religion, about magic, and about power, but I think what is most interesting is how all of them combine, right? And honestly, to me, it reminds me of Gnosticism. More specifically, if we look at the character Father or Dwarf in the Flask. I know this seems far-fetched, but please hear me out on this. Like, I just know I'm right in my head. Okay, so starting with the character, the dwarf in the flask, right? I want to separate both names, so the dwarf in the flask and Father, because I think they are slightly two different characters. So starting with the dwarf in the flask, obviously he is created. He doesn't remember how, but he knows that he was created by a very powerful and anonymous alchemist in order to find immortality. So from the get-go, he is an immortal being. So therefore, it makes him immediately above everyone else, every other human, because he is immortal, right? So when he meets Hohenheim, obviously he is originally thankful because he was created by his blood, but also he knows that he is superior, right? Because Hohenheim is only a mere human. So immediately what he does is start manipulating people and Hohenheim in order to get his way. Because at the end of the day, he is a creature that is inside a flask. So he has no power whatsoever. He is absolutely powerless. So the only thing that he can do is manipulate people in order to get his way. And then when he turns into the character Father, when he gets his own body and his own independence, that is when we see how powerful the dwarf in the flask actually is. And this circle of transmutation that he does with Amestris is in order to meet the truth. Because what he wants himself, what Father wants, or what the dwarf in the flask wants, is to become the truth. He wants the knowledge to be perfect, right? Because he is immortal already. He is extremely powerful, but he doesn't have all the knowledge, because at the end of the day, he is a lesser being than the truth. And that is exactly what Gnostics believe, right? So if you transpolate it, or like if you extrapolate it to Gnosticism, actually we have the real God, right? Which is the truth, the knowledge, Sophia, right? He is the one true creator, right? But then the lesser God, or the lesser being that we are venerating, is the demiurge, is this powerful but lowly God that actually has created all these religions like Judaism, Christianism, Islam, in order to feel venerated, which is exactly what the dwarf in the flask does and what Father does. So in this sense, Truth, the character, is the real God because he has the real, well, it has the real knowledge, but Father, or the dwarf in the flask, is actually the demiurge. And here is Father's biggest mistake, because he believes that by gaining knowledge, he will gain power, he will become like truth. But actually, there is one mistake that he makes, and here is the brutal truth, and is that knowledge cannot be conquered, it cannot be replaced, and it cannot be achieved. Because at the end of the day, Father's biggest mistake is the fact that he has committed the one human flaw that everyone has: arrogance. What makes Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood so interesting is the fact that it refuses to give easy answers, because human beings are capable of doing wonderful things. Like, we create art, community, science, beauty, and philosophy, but we can also do unimaginable cruel things. We create empires, we create conflicts and war, but also we allow famine and death to exist in this world. So at the end of the day, what matters here, or the main point of this story, is not the fact that we have the knowledge to do either good or bad. It's the fact that we try to control it, and we only try to focus on one of the sides. We need to have the whole perspective of the human being in order for us to understand each other. That's all for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you like this recommendation. If you have watched the anime, please make sure that you put down, or that you write down in the comments, why you liked it, and we can discuss. I would love to hear about your guys' opinion. And if you haven't watched the anime, please make sure that you do, because if you like my content, I think you will love the series too. And also, if you would like more anime or manga recommendations, please make sure that you put it in the comments as well. I have tons of them. And before you go, make sure that you follow me on my social media platforms on TikTok and Instagram. I post there every day and have a lot of content about this series. So yeah, make sure that you follow me. And again, thank you so much for watching. I hope I'll see you next week, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.